In recent months, analysts on Wall Street have increasingly noted that Nvidia, which until recently dominated nearly every segment of the global AI chip market, is beginning to gradually lose one of its largest and most strategically important markets, China. What for a long time remained a semi-hidden trend is now becoming clear. Beijing has begun a phased restriction of Nvidia's access to key supplies of raw materials, component modules, and infrastructure chains that are critical for the production of advanced GPUs. This is not a formal ban or a loud public statement at the ministerial level. It is quieter, more precise, more deliberate. China is acting through shadow regulation, quotas, and what sources from the Financial Times call production suffocation, the gradual tightening of oxygen without direct strikes. According to sources from China's National Development and Reform Commission cited by Nikkei Asia, the issue primarily concerns rare earth metals needed for the production of high-density printed circuit boards and superconducting elements used in the architecture of the H-series and newer computing accelerators. These are metals in which China's share of global production exceeds 70%. Officially, Beijing claims this is not a ban, but an optimization of export controls in the interests of national security. In practice, however, companies linked to Nvidia through subcontracting chains are already reporting delays, additional inspections, and new bureaucratic requirements that make shipments unprofitable or technically impossible. The Wall Street Journal, citing U.S. officials, writes that this is a retaliatory measure against U.S. export restrictions imposed by the Department of Commerce back in 2023 and 2024. At that time, Washington restricted exports of A100, H100, and derivative chips to China, citing the threat of AI militarization. Nvidia attempted to bypass the ban by developing special reduced versions of its accelerators, H20, L20, and A800. But as CNBC notes, China saw this as a sign of disrespect toward its technological sovereignty and as an indication that the US intends to keep key computing capabilities for itself. Now, according to Bloomberg sources in Beijing, Chinese state corporations and banks have received an informal directive to minimize critical technological dependence on Nvidia by the end of 2026. The most remarkable aspect of this situation is the speed with which China is restructuring its own semiconductor ecosystem. 5 years ago, Chinese accelerators were considered an order of magnitude weaker than their American counterparts. But today, companies like Huawei, Biren, More Threads, and several closed research consortia, directly funded by the State Council, are already producing chips that domestic analytical centers describe as a full replacement for the A100 in internal clusters. And although they still lag behind the H100 and GH200 in absolute performance, China is following a different logic: replacement first, superiority later. At the same time, China is increasing pressure on the mining sector. According to the South China Morning Post, domestic mining enterprises have received new regulatory guidelines limiting export quotas and establishing priority for domestic processing. In the US, this is already being called the quiet nationalization of global supply chains. At Nvidia, this is described differently, as a strategic shock. If we lose stable access to China's raw material base, we will have to completely rebuild the entire production logistics. Politico Asia quotes one of Nvidia's top executives as saying, "But the more painful blow was not the issue of raw materials, but the market itself. China has not only stopped purchasing Nvidia's flagship accelerators, but has also begun massively subsidizing its own manufacturers." Huawei is already receiving multi-billion-dollar state packages to expand production of the Ascend 910C, and state-owned cloud giants, China Mobile, China Telecom, and Alibaba Cloud, have been instructed to build data centers exclusively based on local chiplets. That is why, as Jensen Huang confirmed in a recent interview, Nvidia's share of the Chinese AI chip market, which until recently stood at about 95%, has now effectively fallen to zero. For Nvidia, this is not just the loss of a major client, it is the loss of the scale upon which the company's entire business model was built. Chinese orders provided the critical load density for TSMC, lowered the cost per chip, and allowed Nvidia to recoup new architectures faster. Without China, production costs rise, development cycles lengthen, and design risks increase. And as China systematically removes Nvidia from its internal technological cycle, it becomes clear that this is not a one-time replacement of a supplier, but a complete reformatting of the architecture of the AI economy. Inside China, a model is emerging in which everything, from the extraction of metals to the final software stack, operates without the participation of American companies. This is not just import substitution. It is the construction of an independent technological system in which Nvidia becomes a historical step, not a foundation. The largest players, Huawei, Byron, Inspur, and Sugon, have received government approval not only to produce chips, but also to control cloud computing, scientific modeling, and big data infrastructure. They do not compete within the market. They have been assigned the role of structural pillars of the new digital architecture. China does not merely buy. China copies, improves, reduces costs, and scales. Where Nvidia relied on technological superiority, China is betting on mass, organization, and systemic control. Nvidia's sales in China continue to decline, and this decline is becoming structural. Whereas earlier the drop could be explained by sanctions, now it is explained by irrelevance. China has rebuilt its cloud centers around its own frameworks, rewritten training libraries, and optimized data transmission according to its own logic of distributed computing. What was built over 10 years around CUDA is now being replaced block by block. And once the foundation of software compatibility begins to diverge, there is no way back. Transitioning to Nvidia now is not a hardware purchase. It means dismantling what has already been built. No government client in China will agree to that. As China switches its infrastructure to its own AI accelerators, supply restrictions and resource barriers begin to work in the opposite direction, now against Nvidia. The company is being forced to seek alternative supply chains, move production, sign new logistics contracts, and urgently form research alliances with India, Vietnam, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. But these markets are not comparable in scale to China, which for years served as Nvidia's primary engine of global expansion. This is why Washington outwardly reacts calmly. Within Trump's circle, it is presented as a victory, that an American company is now independent of China and no longer finances its technological rise. In Republican circles, the idea is spreading that this frees Nvidia, making it a national asset. But that is the strategic mistake. Nvidia was not just supplying chips, it was maintaining the global benchmark standard. It was the foundation around which the AI infrastructure was built as a single global system. And now the entire world is watching as this unified system begins to split into two technological continents. One is the Western world, dependent on Taiwan's semiconductors and Nvidia's computational standards. The other is the Eastern world, growing within China's domestic market, where architectures, platforms, and algorithms are formed autonomously. And the further these systems diverge, the harder it will be to restore a shared model of interaction. Nvidia now faces a choice that will determine not a quarterly report, but its place in history. Either it firmly secures itself within the Western bloc, becoming a pillar of the military, scientific, and corporate AI infrastructure of the United States and Europe, or it tries to return to Asia, but that would mean risking confrontation with its own government and having to surrender part of its technology, part of its autonomy, and part of its strategic control. Both paths lead to the loss of something essential,